Greetings and salutations, my friend. Autogynephilia is a subject that creates a lot of controversy and a lot of disagreement as well. Disagreements about the nature of the phenomenon and the existence of the phenomenon as well. Some claim autogynephilia exists, others claim it doesn't. So let's take a look at the concept of autogynephilia, its origin, as well as how it's being used today. Now, I'm not an AGP myself, so this video is going to be told from a perspective of a non-AGP person who attempted to transition in the past, but I will have someone who is a autogynephile on my channel in the near future. The term autogynephilia first got coined by Ray Blanchard back in the 80s. So let me tell you from the start that I'm not really a big Blanchard fanboy. I do not agree with everything Blanchard theory says, and for this reason I'm not going to be affirming this theory completely. Instead, I will critically examine Blanchard's theory to find out whether there is some truth to it, as well as address the common criticism against autogynephilia theory. And at the end, I will also offer my own take on autogynephilia. Blanchard's study of autogynephilia was done on 119 trans women. Now, 119 sounds like a relatively low number of people, but I imagine in the 80s it was much harder to find trans people than it is right now. A lot of people would say that Blanchard focused only on trans women in his research. That is not exactly the case. Blanchard did some research on trans men as well, but concluded that they all fall under the one category, the so-called homosexual transsexual, which actually means a trans man who's attracted to women. So if you go by the definition of gender, that will be the heterosexual. For this reason, terms like homosexual and heterosexual can be confusing depending on the person believes that one's sexuality is dependent on their gender or their sex. For this reason, I'm going to be using only terms like androphilic and gynephilic for the rest of this video. A lot of the time when we're speaking of autogynephilia, we are referring to Blanchard's typology. Blanchard concluded that trans women fall into either of these categories: the androphilic trans women and non-androphilic trans women. Non-androphilic categories include exclusive attraction to women, attraction to both genders, or to neither. Blanchard's study suggests that 87.5% of gynephilic trans women show or have shown the cross-gender arousal in response to wearing women's clothing. Also, 65.7% of bisexual trans women have shown this type of arousal, and 75% of asexual trans women. In comparison, only 15% of androphilic trans women reported this type of arousal. Now, if you look at those numbers, 87% in gynephilic trans women and 15% in androphilic trans women, that's quite a huge gap. That's the majority of gynephilic trans women who are experiencing or have experienced this type of arousal, and only a very small portion of androphilic trans women who have experienced this type of arousal. I'm going to get back to that later, but what I think is a very important thing to note that is even Blanchard's study shows that autogynephilia may not be exclusive to gynephilic trans women. Trans women attracted to men may also experience cross-gender arousal. A lot of Blanchard's study suggests that at its core, people are transitioning for sexual reasons. Sometimes the concept of this typology is presented such as the androphilic trans women are transitioning because they want to have sex with straight men, whereas the androphilic women are also transitioning for sexual reasons, but that has more to do with the paraphilia itself. Now, what I think is not necessarily the case is the fact that anyone attracted to men who is transitioning is doing so to sleep with heterosexual men. This idea, and I think it's really well represented in our culture when it has this idea that trans women are tricking straight men into sleeping with them, right? And this whole idea of a trap. So I'm not a big fan of that idea, and as someone who has transitioned from male to female at one point and detransitioned, and I'm also I'm a homosexual, so I'm an androphilic person primarily. So it's not like I wanted to do that because I wanted to sleep with straight men. A lot of the time, that is actually more of an accidental cause. But I do think that most trans women who are attracted to men, either primarily or exclusively, want to sleep with or have a relationship with straight men. But this idea that it is the desire to sleep with straight men is the primary reason for transition, I think it's wrong. The reason why most trans women want to sleep with straight men is because they want to be attracted. They want those men to be attracted to them as a woman. They don't want to sleep with gay men because they do not want those men to be attracted to them as men. From what I've noticed, there are some people who use the Blanchard's typology who are completely ignoring that fact. In a way, I would say that the main difference between a gay male child and someone who has developed a form of either mild or moderate or severe gender dysphoria, and as such also identifies as transgender, is this one simple factor, that gay males want to sleep with other gay males, whereas the trans women want to sleep with straight men. So there is some truth, though, Blanchard, that there is some sexual motivation behind transition a lot of the time. I don't necessarily think it's the case in every single instance someone transitions, but I don't think we should be ignoring that either. And a big part of that sexual motivation also reflects the self, how one sees themselves. So that sexuality is sort of directed towards you, but not always in the way that Blanchard talks about. I'm going to come back to that later, but let's move on for now. Even Blanchard acknowledged on the Transparency podcast that he doesn't think that this is the primarily main or only goal for someone to transition. Just listen to this.
I think that, clearly the male to female transsexuals of the homosexual type, for prospective partners, they want heterosexual men. They don't want gay men. And so I think it's easy to make a jump from that and say that the homosexual male to females transition in order to attract heterosexual men. I think that's too strong a formulation. I think it's undoubtedly true. Yes, they want heterosexual men, but I don't think that they do the surgical and hormonal transition for the sole purpose of attracting heterosexual men. I think they mostly do it to feel more comfortable in society. And, some of them are just so feminine that no matter how hard they tried to butch it up, it wasn't going to work, So they make a kind of calculated decision. Well, I can't butch it up, so I'll go the whole other way and be a woman. And this will I'll come out the other end as normal.
There's one thing Blanchard says that I absolutely 100% relate to, and that is the idea that I will do it better as a woman than as a man, and that was the reason why I transitioned. That was a very major part of the causes behind my transition. It's exactly like Blanchard says it, like there's no way I could succeed as a man, so it's better to just go all the way the other way. I think this is spot on, and I'm not saying that every single person who, or every single trans woman who will or is or has transitioned is going to relate to that or experience that, but me personally, I very much relate to that, and I think that if it is something to relate, your chances of perhaps detransitioning in the future, when you actually analyze those thoughts in your head, are more likely than the chance to detransition in someone who is not relating to that at all. Another common criticism to Blanchard is that there are only exclusively two types of transsexual women. And you know, even Blanchard acknowledged that there are cases that don't really fit in either of these two, but those are the two main ones. And you know, maybe those are the main ones, but I think it's also important to focus on those cases that either don't fit in there or perhaps that cross over with each other. A lot of trans people and trans activists are not really big fans of Blanchard's theory, and Blanchard himself, well, when I look at his work, I don't think Blanchard was a TERF or a particularly anti-trans. Blanchard actually meant that both groups should be allowed to transition. But it's the fact that in the early 2000s, when the term autogynephilia first became popularized by Michael Bailey and Lawrence, is when it caught some attention. Since then, the term has been used primarily by anti-trans people as well as trans-exclusionary radical feminists, also known as TERFs. A lot of trans people will tell you that there is no such thing as autogynephilia. But what exactly does that mean, that there is no such thing as autogynephilia? What are they trying to say through that? Are they trying to say that it is impossible for a man to be aroused by the idea of being a woman, that it is impossible for someone to be aroused by the idea of wearing the clothing associated with opposite sex and so on? It seems that most trans people and most trans positive people acknowledge that this type of arousal actually exists. Julia Serano, in her paper The Case Against Autogynephilia, acknowledged that there is no reason to doubt that such a thing as cross-gender arousal actually exists. It would seem that most people are not denying the cross-gender arousal. Well, where does that lead us? Well, maybe we should start separating the term autogynephilia from cross-gender arousal. So someone can mean that autogynephilia does not exist, but cross-gender arousal does exist. Well, I think this can be understood in two different ways. Either cross-gender arousal and autogynephilia are not the same thing, and cross-gender arousal is just a component of the entirety of the term that autogynephilia is. And that cross-gender arousal is just a component of the whole that is autogynephilia, but not its explanation in and of itself. The other way we can look at it is that someone may agree that cross-gender arousal does exist, but not autogynephilia, and what they mean by that is that autogynephilia is a stigmatizing term that we should not be using. This is something a lot of trans people and a lot of trans activists will tell you, that we should completely abandon this term. It's stigmatizing, it is humiliating towards trans people, especially trans women, because this term is practically only ever thrown at trans women. A lot of the time we don't really talk about autoandrophilia, right? Which will be the case in, let's say, trans men, right? It's primarily this idea that the society may view trans women as predators, which I think is wrong. Since the term gets so weaponized against trans people, and especially trans women, by anti-trans individuals and groups, it is completely justifiable that trans people would not want to use that term. And even Blanchard expressed some concern that this term became weaponized in the way it is, because that wasn't Blanchard's original intention. For this reason, I think that trans people's opinion on and strong negative feelings towards autogynephilia are completely justifiable, and I understand why someone would not want to use that term. However, should we completely ignore what Blanchard was trying to say? And I do not think that Blanchard's theory is 100% correct. I am just thinking that there is some truth to it. A lot of evidence that supports the existence of autogynephilic tendencies can be found on Reddit. The YouTuber Ray Williams has done some videos on this subject. Go check out his channel, it's definitely worth watching. He has done a couple of videos in which he goes through Reddit posts.
Just a fetish or something else. Trigger warning, dysphoria, self-loathing, denial. Something I feel like I'm not a trans girl, I'm just a man with a fetish to turn into a woman, because honestly, I don't think or act like a woman. I'm pretty masculine-ish. I can pass as a man, but I don't feel like one. That I'm stuck as a boy, never able to grow up mentally. I had this thought when I wore panties and short shorts to bed. It felt so good that I just had to masturbate. Man, feels wrong to do this. I don't know. I'm just looking for women who have similar experiences as mine. Okay, so clearly this is evidence of autogynephilia. This is the classic prototypical description of autogynephilia. It is a fetish or a paraphilic interest in turning into a woman. Okay, let's see what the comments say. Do the comments acknowledge the reality of autogynephilia, or do they gaslight this person into thinking that they must be really trans? And I'm not saying that it's like one or the other, that if you have autogynephilia, you like can't be trans, because autogynephilia is a cause of trans identity. So this person says, okay, first off, deep breath. Doubt is perfectly normal with anything like this. And yes, quite a few women tend to get a hard on when they start to dress in the correct clothes. Sometimes the brain relates euphoria and arousal since they use the same part of the brain. Okay, so first off, correct clothes. What does it mean, correct clothes? Aren't trans activists always saying that clothes don't have gender? Welcome to the guilt-ridden joy that is a euphoria boner. No, you're not alone in that. Okay, so this is what they euphemistically describe this is how they describe autogynephilia. They describe it as a euphoria boner.
The argument often is that this sort of behavior is often very normal in females. That it's just a sign that you are woman inside, or that it's very, very common to experience cross-gender arousal at first, but it evolves, right? Like, this is not the primary reason why someone would transition. Yet, you know, even when someone calls themselves an autogynephiles, is open about it, and identifies as such, that will still meet the same reaction from trans community a lot of the time. Nope, that doesn't exist, that is not true, that's not what you are. And I'm thinking, like, isn't it denying someone their right to see themselves as such sort of hypocritical when it comes to, from a group of people who think we should be validating all identities? In some ways, Blanchard's theory can be understood that this arousal is sort of what kickstarts the transition, but not necessarily what motivates it along the way. Blanchard also states that males with gender dysphoria who are attracted to other men are more likely to grow out of it as they get older, whereas the gynephilic trans women are more likely to develop more gender dysphoria as they grow older. It often intensifies, which pushes someone into transition. You know, looking at it, I think there is some truth to it. I think that there are individuals whose gender dysphoria is going to disappear as they grow up, and then there are those whose gender dysphoria will intensify, especially with puberty and so on. But okay, I agree that those two categories exist, but I still think that Blanchard's typology theory is oversimplifying what is actually going on. Now, let's take a look at another study that was very similar to what Blanchard did back in the 80s, but this study was done in 2005. Now, the results of this study are somewhat similar, but also show us something very different. According to this study, 53.8% of non-androphilic trans women had experienced some level of cross-gender arousal, and 29.5% of androphilic trans women have experienced cross-gender arousal. Well, now, already back during the Blanchard study, we have seen that, well, yes, autogynephilia may also occur in androphilic trans women, right? Anyone who's attracted to males, but those were very, very small numbers. Well, this study shows us something a little different, that this gap between the two is not as big as we have thought previously. Is this something Blanchard was wrong about? Probably. He was wrong about something else as well, is that trans men come primarily only in one single format, and that is attracted to women. I think that Blanchard's study just wasn't excessive enough, and a lot more study has been done since then that seems to be more correct. We know there are trans men attracted to other men, and the number of those trans men is much higher than what Blanchard predicted. 2005 study also shows us that autogynephilia is not exclusive to non-androphilic trans women, that androphilic trans women, or anyone who transitions and is a male, they can also experience autogynephilia as well. This already puts holes in Blanchard's typology. We cannot really distinguish between a homosexual and autogynephilic transsexuals, because what we see here is the existence of the homosexual autogynephilic phenomenon. And while I don't relate to the concept of autogynephilia myself, I think that arousal with cross-dressing among homosexual men is not as uncommon as we like to think. I think that a lot of homosexual drag queens have also experienced level of arousal during cross-dressing. Now, this arousal is not necessarily indicative of autogynephilia, because transvestic cross-dressing is not autogynephilia. I do not think of those as the same thing, really. Now, I wish to refer to a video of autogynephilia done by ContraPoints, and I bet a lot of you know who ContraPoint is. If not, go check out ContraPoint's channel. She makes a lot of interesting and fun videos on the topic of trans and everything surrounding trans. She's pretty funny. I like her.
Now, I'm going to argue that this theory is wrong, but first I want to acknowledge that there does seem to be some observational validity to the claim that trans women tend to fall into one of two clusters of correlated traits. I'll replace the stigmatizing terms homosexual, transsexual, and autogynephile with more neutral language. Let's say cluster A and cluster B. Cluster A trans women are mostly androphilic, that is, attracted to men. They transition relatively early in life and are very effeminate as children. Cluster B trans women are mostly gynephilic, attracted to women, transition relatively later in life, and have outwardly boyish childhoods. When I first thought about this typology, it initially seemed pretty valid. I went through the mental list of trans women I know and found I could pretty easily sort them. Cluster A, cluster A, cluster B, cluster B. But as I've thought about it more, it's partially unraveled. Without even leaving my circle of acquaintances, I can think of a trans woman who followed all the cluster A patterns but now dates women, and a trans woman who followed all the cluster B patterns but now exclusively dates men. So while I think there may really be two genuine trends here, I interpret them merely as correlation clusters that get fuzzy around the edges. Blanchard, however, takes homosexual transsexuals and autogynephiles to be two sharply distinct types, with two completely different psychosexual motivations to transition.
You know, I have to agree with ContraPoints here. I just find Blanchard's theory to lack certain details. And like I said, I think there is some truth at its core, but it just has this missing link there, you know? And as such, it fails to capture the bigger picture here. But I don't think we should be disregarding Blanchard's theory completely. I rather think we should be continue building up on it. ContraPoints made an attempt at comparing the sexuality to the female sexuality.
I know a cis woman who, having just bought some expensive lingerie, told me, "It's not for men, it's for me." What does that mean? It means she enjoyed wearing sexy lingerie under her clothes because it made her feel hot. Is that cisvestic autogynephilia? Likewise, I used to date cis women, I know what they do, and I can tell you that women touching their own breasts during sex or while masturbating is not at all uncommon. Is that anatomical autogynephilia?
Yeah, she makes some good points there, but I think we are forgetting something, that the female sexuality, which also in some way is directed to the woman herself, is not the same as the male sexuality directed to oneself as a woman, the autogynephilic male fantasy. I don't think those two things can truly be compared. And I agree with ContraPoints that at certain points throughout the transition, one may adapt a more female type of sexuality due to hormone levels. Oh, of course, I won't be denying that that is the case, but the source of origin is still very different, right? Like most women, when they hit puberty, they do not start as autogynephiles. In many ways, I feel very sympathetic towards autogynephiles. I feel sorry for them. I just think that autogynephilia might just be one of the most misunderstood paraphilias out there. Just think about it. One side denies your existence at worst, or at best they try to discredit your existence, whereas the other side tries to portray you as a predator. And I think it's quite a myth that most autogynephiles are predators. I truly don't think it's the case. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being an autogynephile, as long as you do not include other non-consenting people in your kink. They already do not get acknowledged by trans community, but they are also being demonized by TERFs and anti-trans groups. But then again, trans people are also receiving the same end of that stick. But those who actually are autogynephiles, I think they are the ones who get hit the most. And I think that a lot of the time people exaggerate just how many people who transition or transsexual people actually are autogynephiles. I think it's highly exaggerated. I think it's a tactic to dehumanize people by portraying them as perverts, first and foremost. And second of all, most AGPs do not wish to expose themselves in public bathrooms or changing rooms so others can see them. There is another element to that, the exhibitionistic characteristic and property of that type of sexuality, which does not have to come with AGP. Another problem I see with this whole autogynephilia thing is that we also judge whether someone is an autogynephile or is not based on their appearance. So when a trans woman transitions, it is not always completely up to her how passing she will be. I mean, yes, of course, you can take certain steps to pass better, but there are certain trans women who appear very masculine in their appearance, especially if they have transitioned later in life. So for some reason they tend to think that if a trans woman appears as a woman, she's not an AGP, but if she looks like this, she is an AGP. And, I'm sitting here thinking, isn't that kind of similar to how we perceive another thing? And I'm talking about people who rhyme with torpedoes. You know what I'm talking about? There is a certain look we associate with that. Well, we look at this person, we might be thinking, yeah, definitely torpedo. But we are forgetting that some of those people are those friendly-looking female teachers as well. I don't think we should be basing autogynephilia on one's appearance. For all we know, this trans woman may be an AGP, this one may be not. You can't really know with certainty, and I think it all boils down to just judging a book by its cover. Although it's very understandable why women would feel more unsafe around this person in a public bathroom, right? This is purely instinctual. That's why I don't think AGPs should be getting all the shit they're getting. They're humans too. So I do not promote kink shaming in any way, shape or form, unless the said person does something to hurt others. In that case, please take out your pitchforks.
Cut his freaking balls off!
So my take on that is that I think definitely that autogynesexual experience exists because there are people who experience and describe it, but I think the question is rather, in what form does autogynephilia exist? So I mentioned earlier that I don't think autogynephilia is synonymous with cross-gender arousal. I think that all cases of autogynephilia contain cross-gender arousal, but not all cases of cross-gender arousal are a case of autogynephilia. So for example, let's take a male who likes to wear female lingerie when he masturbates, right? That turns him on, but he doesn't necessarily view himself as female in his fantasies. He's just a man wearing lingerie. It's sort of similar to some adults who get turned on by wearing diapers. Now, those adults will not necessarily see themselves as kids, and even in their sexual fantasies they may not be fantasizing about being babies. They just like to wear diapers, they like the sensation associated with that and look of it and so on, but they do not have a sexual fantasy being a baby. Now, there are those who do, right? But I think those are two very different examples. But moving on, I also wish to take a bit of an etymological look at the word autogynephilia. If we break apart this whole word, we get three separate parts here. Auto, self, gyne, woman, philia, love. A lot of the time, when we think of the word that include phil or philia, we are thinking of sexuality, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to mean so. Let's take, for example, philosophy, the love of wisdom. We are not necessarily talking about the sexual love of philosophy here, although between you and me, I live in Norway, and in Norwegian language we have a word for homosexuality, which is homophilie. Again, philia. Now, this also relates to love, but this includes both romantic and sexual love as well. So, forget the gyne part for now, and let's just focus on autophilia, self-love. There are different ways you can look at the term love, right? Self-love can be seen as a very positive thing, right? Like, I think everyone should be loving themselves. Then we can think of the narcissistic type of self-love. But autophilia could also be understood as autosexuality. I prefer to call it philia rather than sexuality, because I think we can talk here both about romantic and sexual attraction to the self. Like, actually genuinely falling in love with yourself or feeling attracted to yourself, both emotionally and sexually. Now, we can easily just take this road when we simply compare it to narcissism. Like, who else other than a narcissist would fall in love with themselves? But I don't necessarily think that autophilia is autonomous, just like someone doesn't really have much choice in whether they are attracted to men or women, or both or neither. Apparently the number of autosexuals, people who are sexually attracted to themselves, is very low, and usually it comes with homosexuality, because you probably need to be homosexual in order to be attracted to yourself as a member of the same sex. But, I'm also asking myself sometimes, can a man be autoandrosexual, attracted to their own masculinity? And if autosexuality exists, then the standard form for a man's autosexuality is autoandrophilia. And in the case of women, the standard form of autosexuality will be autogynephilia. So it's possible that there are more women out there who are autogynephiles rather than men. However, autosexuality is likely more common in males than females. Since both autosexuality and gender transitions are quite rare, well, in terms of possibility, we also have to ask ourselves of the odds that someone may be both. And unless there is a strong correlation between the two, the possibility of both being present in one individual are actually very small. If that's the case, then a very, very small minority of trans women and trans men would be autogynephilic or autoandrophilic. But if there is a correlation between the two, sort of like there is a correlation between autism and ADHD, then of course it will be more likely that if someone is trans, that they might also be autogynephilic. I think that is something worth looking into in the future research, and I also think that a lot of trans people will be more open to the idea if the term autogynephilia wasn't weaponized against them, if it wasn't demonized. So my proposition is that there's absolutely nothing wrong with being autogynephile or autoandrophile. It's completely normal, and I don't think it necessarily makes someone less or more trans for this reason. They could be. I mean, I think it also depends on how one reacts to, well, in case of males, how they react to estrogen, right? If they go on to adapting more female-like sexuality due to the effects of estrogen, perhaps they might also be suffering from genuine gender dysphoria that may be relieved through that. But if someone actually rejects that female-like sexuality and resolves back to their male sexuality by stopping the intake of hormones at that point, which is actually, I talked to someone who experienced that, where they lost that arousal when they went on estrogen, so they, I wouldn't call it detransitioned, but reverted the process so that they will get that same sex drive and male sexuality back. I think that could be described as a case of strong autogynephilia that is not necessarily combined with gender dysphoria, but I think that too can occur in the same individual. So a lot of the time when we are talking that someone is an autogynephile, we are not really taking into consideration something very important, and that is, are they being primarily attracted to themselves? Because the term as we're using it, yeah, I know how autogynephilia is being used, but I think that unless we are talking about attraction to the self, we shouldn't be really calling it autogynephilia. So I would say a lot of those people who are being referred to as autogynephiles are not truly autogynephiles because of the lack of the autophilia. So some level of arousal associated with the idea of having a feminine body is not necessarily equivalent to actually looking at yourself in the mirror and being attracted towards yourself and wanting to have sex with yourself. And a lot of autosexuals, they want to have sex with themselves. What we are commonly referring to as autogynephiles, they mostly wish to have sex with others to affirm their sexuality. I think we should be calling it something else. I don't know. I don't really have any proposition right now, but if I'll think of it, I'll let you know. Anyway, I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts after watching this video. Maybe you've disagreed on some of the things I said, or maybe everything I said. I highly doubt that there will be one person out there who will say, yep, I agree with you 100% with everything you said. But it's okay. I think it's disagreements and conversations that are driving the progress further. So I think it is definitely something we should be talking about. And I don't think we should be ignoring this concept, and I don't think we should be demonizing this concept either. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Ciao.